Get ready to be transported into the unknown. Welcome back to W-broux, your ultimate escape into chilling tales from the darkest corners of reality. If you're joining us for the first time or you're a returning listener, make sure to hit that subscribe button because here, the fear never sleeps. Before we dive into tonight's spine-tingling story, I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your location in the comments below. Are you tuning in from a dark bedroom, a long night drive, or maybe somewhere even more mysterious? Also, make sure to like the video if you're ready to embrace the darkness with me tonight. Your support keeps the nightmares coming. Story 1: The Mirror in the Attic. Reflections of Fear. Lily had always been fascinated by old houses. When she inherited her grandmother's Victorian estate on the outskirts of town, it felt like a dream come true. The house was beautiful but had seen better days, with its creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and narrow hallways that seemed to stretch into darkness. But what drew her most was the attic, a place her grandmother had always warned her never to enter. "Stay out of the attic," Lily, her grandmother, used to say in a voice that was stern and distant. "Some things are better left forgotten." Lily had obeyed her grandmother's warning when she was younger, but now, with the house in her hands and her curiosity burning, she couldn't resist. She knew that the attic held secrets, and she was determined to uncover them. One crisp autumn afternoon, armed with a flashlight and a sense of adventure, Lily decided it was time to explore the forbidden attic. The narrow stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended, the air growing colder with each step. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight, and the smell of age and decay filled her nostrils. At the top of the stairs, she found a heavy wooden door that seemed to groan in protest as she pushed it open. The attic was dim and cluttered with old furniture, trunks overflowing with faded clothes, and stacks of forgotten books. But in the far corner of the room, something gleamed faintly, catching her eye: a large, ornate mirror. The mirror stood taller than her, its frame intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed almost to move in the flickering light. The glass was old and cloudy, giving off a faint, silvery glow. Despite its age, there was something hypnotic about the mirror, something that drew her closer like a moth to a flame. Lily reached out to touch the frame, her fingers brushing against the cold wood. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the reflection, a shadow that wasn't her own. She jerked her hand back, blinking in surprise, but when she looked again, the mirror showed only her reflection. "Just my imagination," she muttered, trying to shake off the creeping unease. But as she turned to leave, she saw her reflection didn't move. She froze, staring at the mirror in disbelief. She had turned away, but the image in the mirror remained, facing her, its eyes fixed on hers. It was like looking at a photograph of herself that hadn't gotten the message to change. Slowly, her reflection raised its hand, a fraction of a second behind her own movement, and smiled a slow, twisted smile that didn't reach its eyes. Lily's heart began to race, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She knew it wasn't possible, yet she couldn't tear her gaze away. "Hello, Lily," the reflection said in a voice that was her own, yet not quite right. It was colder, distant, echoing from somewhere far away. Lily stumbled back, almost tripping over an old trunk. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The reflection tilted its head, its smile growing wider, more menacing. "I am you, of course. The better version of you, the one that's been waiting all this time." Lily felt like the floor was falling out from under her. The reflection's eyes seemed to pierce through her, like they were looking not at her but into her, seeing every fear, every doubt, every hidden secret. "You're not me," Lily said, her voice firmer this time. "You're not real." The reflection's smile faded, replaced by an expression of mock pity. "Oh, Lily," it said, shaking its head slowly. "You're so naive. You think this is your house? You think you're the first one to stand where you are? This mirror has shown many faces, and now it's your turn." Lily turned and bolted for the attic door, but as she reached it, the door slammed shut on its own, locking her in. She banged on it, calling for help, but the thick wood absorbed her cries. She turned back to the mirror, and her blood ran cold. Her reflection was gone. The mirror now showed the empty attic, but as she watched, shapes began to form in the glass faces emerging from the darkness. They were twisted, contorted, eyes wide with fear, mouths open in silent screams. Dozens of them, maybe more, all trapped in the mirror, staring at her with expressions of anguish. Lily stumbled back, her mind spinning. These were not just reflections, these were people, real people trapped within the mirror's cursed glass. And then she saw her own face appear among them, her own eyes wide and terrified, looking back at her from inside the mirror. "No, no, no," she cried out, shaking her head in disbelief. She grabbed the nearest object, a rusty old candlestick, and swung it at the mirror with all her strength. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, fragments flying everywhere, and for a moment she felt a rush of triumph. But then the shards began to move, floating in the air, piecing themselves back together like a puzzle that refused to be broken. The mirror reassembled itself, the cracks vanishing, and the reflection returned, grinning with that same twisted smile. "You can't destroy me," Lily had said calmly. "I'm part of you now. We are bound, you and I." The reflection reached out from the mirror, its hand pressing against the glass as though it was trying to push through. Lily watched in horror as the glass seemed to ripple like water, and the reflection's hand emerged, fingers curling in the air of the attic. She screamed and stumbled back, watching in disbelief as the reflection pulled itself out of the mirror, its form solidifying, becoming a twisted version of her own body. The creature that stood before her was like a shadow made flesh, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. "Why run?" Lily the creature said, its voice dripping with malice. "I've waited so long to take your place." The thing lunged at her, and Lily felt its cold hand close around her wrist. It felt like ice, numbing her skin, sending a chill straight to her bones. She pulled away, but its grip was strong, stronger than she could have imagined. Desperate, she looked around the attic, searching for anything that might save her. Her eyes fell on an old, tarnished mirror shard lying on the floor. She grabbed it, her hands shaking, and turned it toward the creature. The reflection recoiled, its face twisting in rage as it saw itself in the broken shard. "No," it hissed, its voice cracking. "You can't trap me again." Lily held the shard up like a shield, forcing the creature to back toward the large mirror. Its form began to waver, flickering between solid and smoke, its eyes filled with fury. "You think you can win?" Lily had spat, its voice echoing with 1,000 tormented whispers. "You think you can send me back? The mirror is hungry, and it will have you." With a scream, Lily shoved the shard forward, thrusting it into the creature's chest. The reflection shattered into a burst of darkness, swirling back toward the mirror. It let out a piercing wail as it was sucked into the glass, its face twisting in agony as it was pulled back to where it came from. The mirror trembled, its surface rippling violently, and then with a final shudder, it went still. The attic fell silent, the air heavy and cold. Lily dropped the shard, her hands trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stared at the mirror, now empty, its surface reflecting nothing but the empty room. The faces that had once filled the glass were gone, vanished into the void. She felt like she had won, but the victory was hollow, laced with dread. Lily turned and ran from the attic, slamming the door shut behind her. She locked it, vowing never to open it again. She moved out of the house the very next day, leaving the mirror behind, buried in that dark corner of the attic where it belonged. But even in her new place, miles away from that cursed house, Lily couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed her. She would catch glimpses of her reflection in the window at night, an image that didn't quite match her own movements, a smile that lingered a moment too long. And sometimes late at night, she would hear the soft tap of fingers on glass, the faint echo of a voice that sounded like hers, whispering from the darkness. "Let me out, Lily," it would say. "You can't hide from your own reflection." She knew then that the mirror in the attic wasn't just a cursed object. It was a doorway to a place where reflections weren't just images, but beings that lived and waited and wanted to take her place. And no matter how far she ran, no matter where she hid, the reflection was always there, watching from the other side, waiting for the day when the mirror would crack open again. Story 2. The static on the TV, a glimpse beyond the screen. James had always found comfort in the hum of his television late at night. It filled the silence in his small apartment, drowning out the noises from the street and the creaks of the old building. It was a part of his nightly routine. He'd fall asleep on the couch, the glow of the TV flickering in the background, playing reruns of old shows. But one cold November night, the TV didn't show its usual familiar faces or bright commercials. Instead, it was filled with static, a loud, hissing screen of black and white snow. James frowned as he sat up, rubbing his eyes. He grabbed the remote and tried changing the channel, but no matter which button he pressed, the static remained, stubborn and unyielding. He checked the cable box, the connections, even turned the TV off and back on, but nothing changed. Just the crackling static, the screen flickering like a broken signal. Frustrated, he turned off the TV and decided to call the cable company in the morning. But as he turned to head to bed, he heard something that made him freeze in place. A whisper. James turned slowly back to the TV. He could have sworn he heard it, a faint voice buried in the static, like someone trying to speak from the other side of the screen. He stared at the television, his eyes narrowing, waiting for the sound to return. And then he heard it again, clearer this time. "James, can you hear me?" He blinked, his skin prickling with goosebumps. He leaned closer, his face inches from the screen, trying to make sense of the distorted sound. It was his name, spoken in a voice that was somehow familiar, yet distant, like an echo from a dream. "Who's there?" he said aloud, his own voice sounding strange in the empty room. The static hissed and crackled, and then the voice came again, layered beneath the noise. "You need to help me, James. I'm trapped." James's heart pounded in his chest. "Trapped where? Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. But the static only grew louder, the voice fading back into the white noise, leaving him alone with the flickering screen. James turned off the TV and sat in the dark, his mind racing. He told himself it was just a glitch, a cross signal from some late-night broadcast. But deep down, he knew it was something more, something that shouldn't be possible. The next night, despite his apprehension, he turned the TV on again. Once more, the screen filled with static, and within seconds, the whispering returned, louder, more desperate. "James, you have to listen. They're coming for you." He felt a chill race down his spine. "Who's coming for me?" he demanded. "What do you mean?" The static shifted, the image on the screen distorting, and for a brief moment, James thought he saw a face flickering in and out of focus, trapped in the swirling chaos of the static. The eyes of the face were wide, hollow, staring directly at him. Then it was gone, replaced by a distorted silhouette that seemed to move behind the layers of noise. "I'm you," the voice said, trembling, filled with fear. "I'm the part of you that got lost, and they're coming to take the rest." James stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The words didn't make sense, but the terror in the voice was unmistakable, raw, real, like someone pleading for their life. He turned the TV off, but even with the screen dark, he could still hear the static, faint but persistent, like it was playing somewhere just beyond his hearing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was reaching out to him from the other side of that screen. The next day, he called the cable company and told them about the issue with the TV. The technician on the line sounded puzzled. "Sir, there's nothing wrong with your signal," he said. "Everything's coming through fine on our end. Are you sure the problem isn't with your TV?" James hung up, his hands shaking slightly. He knew what he had seen, what he had heard. The problem wasn't the TV, it was whatever was hiding inside the static. That night, James turned the TV on once more, almost against his will, like he was drawn to it. The static filled the room immediately, louder than ever, the hiss almost deafening. But now, there was no mistaking it, the face was back, clearer this time, emerging from the chaos of the screen. James had said, and this time the voice was his own. He felt like he was staring at a twisted reflection, like looking into a mirror that showed not his face, but his soul. The eyes on the screen were hollow, desperate, and filled with a fear he recognized all too well. "They're here," the voice whispered, and behind the face in the static, James saw shadows, moving figures, shifting shapes that seemed to pulse and writhe in the background. "You have to stop them before they take me too." James's hand shook as he reached for the remote. "Stop who?" "What do you mean?" he shouted, his voice cracking. And then the screen went black. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, slowly, the TV flickered back to life, not with static, but with a new image. It showed his living room, the very room he was sitting in, but from a different angle, like it was being filmed by a hidden camera. He could see himself on the screen, standing in front of the TV, looking confused and frightened. James's blood ran cold. This wasn't possible. How could the TV be showing him a live feed of his own room? He turned around, searching the room for a camera, but found nothing. When he looked back at the screen, his on-screen self was no longer alone. The shadowy figures were in the room with him, standing just behind his on-screen reflection. Their faces were blurred, undefined, like smudges of darkness, but he could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting. "They're inside," the voice whispered from the TV, now panicked. "They're in your home, James. You have to get out." James bolted from the living room, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran to the front door, but just as he reached for the handle, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out. He froze in the darkness, his ears ringing with the faint, ever-present hum of the static. He turned slowly, his back to the door, and saw them, the shadowy figures from the TV, now standing in his living room. They were closer now, their forms clearer, more defined, faces emerging from the darkness, eyes like black holes, mouths twisted into silent screams. "You can't leave," one of them said, its voice a distorted echo of his own. "You're part of this now." James stumbled back, his hands trembling. He fumbled for the light switch, desperate to illuminate the room, but the shadows only grew thicker, closing in on him, wrapping around him like smoke. The TV flickered back to life, and on the screen he saw himself again, only this time he was different. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, his mouth twisted into the same silent scream as the shadowy figures. The static on the TV was inside him now, filling his eyes and mouth, pouring from his ears. The last thing he heard was his own voice, trapped within the hiss of the screen, whispering one final message: "I'm lost, James. And now you are too." The screen went dark, the static falling silent. James stood in the middle of his empty living room, the shadows gone, the TV off. Everything seemed normal, quiet, too quiet. But as he looked into the black screen of the TV, he saw his reflection again. And this time, it wasn't his own face staring back at him. It was the hollow-eyed version of himself, the twisted reflection that had come out of the static, grinning from the other side of the glass. "You let them in," the reflection said, its voice a hollow echo of his own. "And now, they'll never leave." James tried to look away, but he couldn't. His own reflection held him captive, its eyes gleaming with a light that wasn't his. And as the screen began to flicker again, the static returning louder and louder, he felt himself being pulled into it, into the endless noise, the chaos that swallowed everything whole. The last thing he saw before he was lost was his own face, twisted into that hollow grin, disappearing into the white noise. And when the TV finally went dark, the apartment was empty. But if you listen closely, late at night, you can still hear the faint sound of static whispering from the other side of the screen, calling out to anyone who dares to watch. The screen is off, but James is still there, trapped within the static, waiting for the next person to turn on the TV and set him free. Story 3. The haunting melody, a song that never ends. Claire was a pianist, a prodigy, some might say. Music was her life, her way of expressing emotions she could never put into words. When she inherited her grandmother's old piano, she was overjoyed. The piano had been a family heirloom, passed down through generations, and now it sat proudly in the corner of her living room. It was a beautiful instrument, with its deep mahogany finish and keys that had yellowed slightly with age. Claire spent hours each day playing that piano, losing herself in its rich, haunting notes. But soon after it arrived, she began to notice something strange. At night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, she would hear a melody drifting through the halls, a soft, haunting tune that seemed to come from the piano. The melody was slow, almost like a lullaby, its notes gentle but with an undercurrent of sorrow that sent chills down her spine. Claire thought it must be her imagination, or perhaps the wind blowing through a crack in the window. But each night, the melody grew louder, more insistent, as if someone or something was playing it just for her. One evening, determined to find out what was happening, Claire stayed up late, sitting in the darkened living room with only the moonlight streaming through the window. She watched the piano, its keys still and silent, and waited. Just as the clock struck midnight, the melody began again, soft and slow, filling the room with its mournful sound. Claire leaned closer, her eyes widening in disbelief as she saw the keys moving on their own, pressing down as though an invisible hand was playing them. The notes filled the air, echoing through the house like a whisper from another world. She felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up, a shiver running down her spine. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The melody continued, undeterred, weaving through the air like a ghostly lullaby. She reached out slowly, her hand hovering above the keys, and the music stopped instantly, the room falling into an unnatural silence. Claire pulled her hand back, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to think. Was it a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by her own exhaustion? She tried to laugh it off, telling herself that it had to be a coincidence. But deep down, she knew that what she had seen was real. Determined to find an explanation, she dug through the old papers and letters that had come with the piano, searching for any clue to its origins. As she sifted through the yellowed pages, She found a handwritten note from her grandmother that made her blood run cold. To whoever plays this piano, the note began, its words shaky and uneven. Beware the melody that haunts its keys. The song belongs to her. She never rests, and she never forgives. Claire's hands shook as she read the final line, "Do not play her song, or she will come for you." That night she couldn't sleep. The words of the note echoed in her mind, mingling with the melody that seemed to play on repeat in the darkest corners of her thoughts. She couldn't get the haunting tune out of her head, like it was engraved in her soul. The next evening, she decided to confront the piano once and for all. She sat down on the bench, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the keys. She played a simple scale, then a few chords, and everything seemed normal. But then, without her willing it, her hands moved on their own, playing the first few notes of the melody she'd heard in the night. She tried to pull her hands away, but they wouldn't move. It was as if the piano had taken control of her, guiding her fingers to play the song. The melody grew louder, the notes more desperate, filled with a sorrow that seemed to seep into her very bones. "Stop," she cried, trying to wrench her hands free. "Please stop." But the piano ignored her pleas, its music swelling to a crescendo. And then she felt it, a presence, cold and angry, filling the room. She looked up and saw her reflection in the polished surface of the piano. But it wasn't her own face staring back at her. It was the face of a woman, pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that seemed to mock her pain. The woman's lips moved, though Claire couldn't hear what she was saying. But then the whisper reached her ears, a voice like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "You played my song," the woman said, her smile widening. "Now you belong to me." The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering reflection of the woman in the piano's surface. Claire felt the air grow cold, so cold that her breath fogged in front of her. She could feel the presence surrounding her, closing in, as the music played on, louder and faster, spinning out of control. "Who are you?" Claire shouted, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The woman's face twisted into a look of rage. "You stole my song," she hissed, "and now I will steal your soul." The music reached a fever pitch, and Claire's fingers burned as they moved faster and faster, blurring over the keys. She tried to scream, but no sound came out, her voice trapped in her throat. The woman in the reflection seemed to grow larger, her eyes burning with a fire that threatened to consume everything. Just when Claire thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the music stopped, the final note echoing like a tolling bell. The woman in the reflection disappeared, and Claire fell back from the piano, gasping for air. The room was silent again, but the echoes of the haunting melody seemed to linger in the air, refusing to fade. She backed away from the piano, her heart pounding. But then she noticed something even more terrifying. The sheet music on the stand had changed. The notes were no longer the familiar melody she'd been playing. Instead, they formed words, scrawled in a jagged hand that seemed to cut into the paper. "She will come when you play the last note," it read. "She will take what is hers." Claire's eyes widened in horror. She realized that the melody was incomplete, that the song was still unfinished. And that's why the spirit of the woman was still trapped, waiting, watching, until someone dared to finish what had been started long ago. She knew then that her only chance was to destroy the piano, to break its hold over her before the final note could be played. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and swung it at the piano with all her strength. The strings snapped, the wood splintered, but the piano's haunting echo didn't fade. As the instrument shattered, a scream tore through the air, high-pitched and inhuman, the voice of the woman in the reflection. The room filled with a cold wind that whipped around Claire, sending papers flying and windows rattling. but she kept swinging, kept striking the piano, until it was nothing more than a pile of broken wood and twisted strings. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the wind stopped. The air grew still, the room silent once more. The broken pieces of the piano lay at her feet, lifeless, empty. Claire collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking. But even as she sat there, breathing heavily, she knew it wasn't over. She could still hear it, faint and distant, the haunting melody, like a whisper in the back of her mind. It was quieter now, but it was still there, waiting for the moment when it would rise again. Claire moved out of the house the very next day, leaving the shattered piano behind. She tried to forget the melody, to drown it out with new songs, new music. But no matter where she went, no matter what she played, she could still hear it. Late at night, when the world was quiet and still, the melody would drift through the darkness, a ghostly tune that echoed in her dreams, pulling her back to that room, to that cursed piano, to the woman who still waited for the final note to be played. And Claire knew that someday, somewhere, the song would start again. And when it did, it would never end. Story 4. The flickering light, a warning in the darkness. David had just moved into his new apartment, a modest place in a quiet building that suited his needs perfectly. It was close to work, affordable, and best of all, it was finally his own space. The apartment itself was old but cozy, with wooden floors that creaked slightly underfoot and large windows that let in plenty of light during the day. But at night, things felt different. From the very first night, David noticed a strange quirk about the place. The light in the hallway outside his apartment would flicker on and off, as if it couldn't decide whether to stay lit or plunge into darkness. He told himself it was just an old light bulb, something that needed replacing. But the way it flickered felt almost deliberate, like a signal, a Morse code he didn't understand. One evening, as he was watching TV, the flickering began again, casting odd shadows that danced across his living room wall. The light outside his door buzzed faintly, its hum rising and falling with each flicker. David grabbed a chair and opened his front door, intending to fix the light bulb himself. As he stood on the chair and reached for the bulb, the light flickered out completely, plunging him into darkness. For a moment, he was enveloped by the pitch-black hallway, and in that brief instant, he thought he saw something move in the corner of his eye, a shadow that wasn't his own. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The light snapped back on, its sudden brightness making him blink. He shook his head, chalking it up to his imagination, and tightened the bulb securely into its socket. Satisfied that he'd fixed the problem, he went back inside and closed the door. But as he turned the lock, the light flickered again. David froze, staring at the door as if it might come alive. The flickering was faster now, more erratic, like a heartbeat growing quicker and quicker. He pressed his ear against the door, listening to the soft hum of electricity, but heard something else, a faint tapping sound, like fingers drumming against the wood. He pulled back, his heart racing. Just the pipes, he muttered, though he didn't quite believe it. The sound had been too deliberate, too rhythmic. He tried to ignore it, to go back to his TV show, but his eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, waiting for the next flicker. The next night, the flickering started again, but this time it was different. The light outside his door blinked in a pattern, 3 short flickers, a pause, then 2 longer ones. It repeated this sequence over and over, like it was trying to send him a message. David watched, puzzled and a little unnerved. He decided to record it with his phone, thinking that maybe he could show it to the landlord or an electrician. But as he held up his phone, something changed. The flickering stopped, and the light went completely out. His phone's screen went dark too, the battery suddenly dead, even though it had been fully charged just moments before. And then, from the other side of the door, he heard a whisper. David, the voice said, low and hoarse, "Let me in." His breath hitched, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. He stared at the door, his mind racing. Who was out there? How did they know his name? He grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it tightly, and approached the door with trembling hands. "Who's there?" he demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Please, let me in." David's blood ran cold. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something else beneath it, a hint of malice, like the speaker was mocking him. He turned the deadbolt, making sure the door was locked tight. Just as he did, the light outside flickered back on. For a split second, it illuminated the shadow of a figure standing on the other side of the door, a tall, thin silhouette with no distinct features, just darkness and an outline that seemed to waver like smoke. David's hand shook as he slowly backed away. The light flickered again, and the shadow was gone. He stood there, heart pounding, staring at the door, waiting for anything to happen. But there was only silence. The next morning, David called the landlord to report the issue with the hallway light. The landlord listened patiently but seemed unconcerned. "It's probably just an old wiring issue," he said. "Those lights have been flickering for years. I'll send someone to check it out when I get the chance." "Has anyone else complained about it?" David asked, hoping for some kind of explanation. The landlord paused, and then his voice turned hesitant. "Not recently," he said. "The last tenant who lived there did, though. She mentioned something about the light and hearing strange noises. But she moved out pretty quickly after that, so I figured it was just nerves." David hung up the phone, more unsettled than ever. He didn't want to believe that he was experiencing the same thing as the previous tenant, but he couldn't deny the mounting evidence. That night, he decided to set up a camera pointed at the hallway, hoping to catch whatever was causing the disturbance. He watched the footage live on his laptop, the hallway illuminated by the flickering light. Hours passed, and nothing happened. He was about to give up when, around 2:45 a.m., the light outside his door began to blink in that same, familiar pattern, 3 short flickers, then 2 long ones. David leaned closer to the screen, his heart pounding. As the light flickered, he saw the shadowy figure, standing at the far end of the hallway, slowly moving toward his door. The camera feed crackled, the image distorting, but he could see it clearly now, a shape without a face, a silhouette that seemed to grow darker with every step. The figure stopped right in front of his door, and then it did something that made David's blood run cold. It raised its hand and tapped on the wood, the exact same rhythm he'd heard before. Then, as if sensing the camera's gaze, it turned its head, staring directly into the lens. The screen went black. David felt a rush of panic as he scrambled to restart the camera feed, but when it finally came back online, the hallway was empty. The light outside his door was steady, no flickering, no shadow, nothing out of place. He replayed the footage over and over, but each time, the moment the shadow turned toward the camera, the screen went black. He knew then that whatever was haunting the light, whatever had called his name from the other side of the door, wasn't going to stop until he acknowledged it, until he let it in. David spent the next few days in a state of constant anxiety, dreading the night when the flickering would start again. He tried to tell his friends about it, but they all said the same thing: he was overreacting, he was imagining things. But he knew what he'd seen. He knew what he'd heard. One night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the light outside his door flickered again. This time, it didn't stop. The flickering was faster, more frantic, casting rapid shadows that danced on the walls. And then, without warning, the light exploded, the bulb shattering in a burst of sparks. David jumped out of bed, grabbing his flashlight. He opened the door and shone the beam into the dark hallway. The air was thick, like he was wading through invisible smoke. And then he heard a voice, whispering right next to his ear. "David, I'm inside now." He turned the flashlight toward the source of the voice and saw it a face, twisted and hollow, staring back at him from the darkness. Its eyes were empty voids, its mouth stretched into a grin that seemed to split its face in two. David dropped the flashlight and ran, slamming his bedroom door shut. He threw himself against the door, bracing it with his weight, but he could feel the cold seep through the wood, feel the presence pressing against the other side. The whispers filled the room, coming from everywhere at once, echoing in his mind. "You let me in," David had said, its voice dripping with malice. "You watched me, you called me, and now I'm never leaving." The lights in his room flickered, casting distorted shadows that stretched and twisted on the walls. He could see the outline of the figure standing just outside his door, its shape bleeding into the light, like ink spreading through water. In a desperate act, David grabbed his phone and dialed the police, his fingers shaking. But when they answered, all he could hear was static hissing, crackling static, and beneath it, the voice again, laughing softly. "Too late," it whispered. "Too late to lock me out now." The lights went out completely, plunging him into darkness. And in that darkness, he felt the cold fingers wrapping around his wrist, pulling him toward the shadows. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the static, by the darkness that consumed everything. And then everything went silent. The next morning, the landlord found David's apartment. Empty. The door was locked from the inside, the hallway light still broken, shards of glass scattered on the floor. No trace of David remained, except for his phone, lying on the floor with the screen cracked and flickering. Later, when the police reviewed the footage from the camera David had set up, they saw at the flickering light, the shadowy figure standing outside his door, and then nothing, just static, like the whole world had blinked out of existence. The apartment was put back on the market a few months later, the light outside fixed, the hallway repainted, and as new tenants moved in, no one ever spoke of the flickering light or the shadow that waited in the dark. But sometimes late at night, when the building is quiet and the lights begin to flicker again, you can still hear it, a faint whisper, echoing from the darkness. "Let me in." And the shadows on the wall never truly go away. Story 5, the voice in the vent secrets whispered in the darkness. Sarah had always thought of her new apartment as a fresh start. After the chaos of the past year, all she wanted was a quiet place where she could breathe and focus on her writing. The building was old but well maintained, with high ceilings and a vintage charm that reminded her of another era. Her favorite feature, though, was the small study where she planned to write her next novel. But from the first night she moved in, she noticed something strange. When everything was quiet and the world outside was still, she would hear a faint sound coming from the vent above her desk, a soft whisper, like someone murmuring just out of reach. She dismissed it at first, assuming it was nothing more than the air ducts, or perhaps a neighbor's muffled conversation traveling through the walls. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew clearer, more insistent, as if the voice was trying to communicate directly with her. One night, as Sarah was working late, she heard it again, the same faint murmur floating through the vent. This time, it was unmistakable. It was saying her name. "Sarah." She froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned her head slowly toward the vent, listening. The whisper came again, clearer now, almost pleading. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Her blood ran cold. She stared at the vent, her mind racing. How could anyone know her name? How could they be inside the vent? She stood up slowly, grabbed a chair, and climbed onto it, leaning closer to the metal grill. She hesitated, her breath shaky, and then spoke. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do you know my name?" The whisper stopped, replaced by a hollow silence that seemed to stretch on forever. She strained to hear something, anything, but all she caught was the soft hum of the building's heating system. She shook her head, climbing down from the chair, convincing herself it must have been her imagination. Perhaps she was just tired and her mind was playing tricks on her. But the voice in the vent wouldn't leave her alone. Over the next few days, the whispers became more frequent. Every night, just as she was drifting off to sleep, she would hear a soft voice calling her name, growing louder, more urgent. Sometimes it would say her name over and over like a chant. Other times it would speak in a language she didn't understand, the words flowing like a song sung in reverse. Sarah decided to ask her neighbors if they'd heard anything unusual. She knocked on the door of the apartment next to hers, where an older woman named Mrs. Kane lived. Mrs. Kane lived. Mrs. Kane looked at Sarah with a puzzled expression when she asked about the voice. "I don't hear anything," dear Mrs. Kane said, shaking her head. "But then again, these old buildings make all kinds of noises. They settle at night, and you'd be surprised how sound travels through the vents. Are you sure it's not just your imagination?" Sarah nodded politely but felt no comfort from the words. Deep down, she knew this wasn't the building settling. This was something else, something that seemed to know her, something that felt alive. One night, unable to sleep, Sarah decided to record the vent with her phone. She placed it right next to the grill and hit the record button, leaving it there as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Hours passed, and all she could hear was the faint hum of the heating system. But then, just as she was starting to drift off, the whispering returned. She sat up quickly, her heart racing, and watched in horror as the vent seemed to vibrate, the whisper growing louder and louder, filling the room. "Sarah, help me," the voice said, its tone now desperate, almost like a sob. "Please, don't leave me here." She grabbed her phone and stopped the recording, her hands shaking as she played it back. The voice was clear, too clear, like it was standing right next to her, speaking directly into her ear. She could hear every breath, every quiver in the words. And then she noticed something that made her blood turn to ice. Behind the whisper, beneath the desperate plea, was another sound, a deeper, rasping breath, like someone or something else was listening to the conversation. Terrified, Sarah decided to call her best friend, Lisa, for help. Lisa arrived within the hour, armed with skepticism and a flashlight. "You've probably got a squirrel or a raccoon stuck in the vents," Lisa said, though her voice was strained with an edge of doubt. "Let's take a look." They unscrewed the grill of the vent, pulling it off to peer inside. Lisa shone the flashlight into the darkness, revealing nothing but a long, narrow tunnel that disappeared into the shadows. But as they stared into the vent, they both heard it, a faint, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled along metal. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her face pale. Lisa nodded, her eyes wide. Yeah, I did." Suddenly, a cold gust of air blew through the vent, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay, like something rotting deep within the walls. They stumbled back, covering their noses, and just as they did, the voice returned, louder than ever. "Help me, Sarah," it pleaded, echoing through the vent. "I'm trapped. Please don't let him find me." Sarah's heart sank as the deeper voice followed, this time clearer, more menacing. "She's mine," it growled, its tone like gravel. "She will never leave this place." The vent rattled violently, the metal grating shaking as if something was trying to claw its way through. Sarah and Lisa screamed, scrambling to put the grill back in place, their hands shaking so badly that it took several tries. When they finally managed to secure it, the rattling stopped and the voice fell silent. They backed away, panting, staring at the vent in horror. "We need to call the police," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "Something is seriously wrong here." Sarah nodded, still in shock, and reached for her phone. But before she could dial, the lights in the room flickered and went out. They were plunged into darkness, the only sound the faint hum of the vent, like a sinister lullaby. And then the whisper returned, softer, almost in a mocking tone. "Too late," Sarah had said. "He's already inside." The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and Sarah could see her breath fogging in the cold air. Shadows seemed to move along the walls, stretching out like dark fingers reaching for her. She backed into the corner, clutching Lisa's arm, her eyes wide with terror. The vent grill began to shake again, the sound of scraping metal filling the room. And then, slowly, a hand emerged from the darkness inside the vent, a pale, skeletal hand with long, claw-like fingers that reached out and wrapped around the edge of the grill. "Run," Sarah screamed, pulling Lisa toward the door. They bolted out of the room, running down the hallway and out of the apartment, slamming the door behind them. They didn't stop until they were outside, gasping for air under the cold night sky. Sarah fumbled with her phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. When the police arrived, they searched the apartment thoroughly, prying open the vent, shining flashlights into every corner of the system. But they found nothing. No voice, no hand, no sign that anyone or anything had ever been there. "Must have been a prank or an echo from another unit," one of the officers said, though his face betrayed his uncertainty. "These old buildings have a way of playing tricks on you." Sarah didn't care what they said. She knew what she had seen, what she had heard. She moved out of the apartment that very night, refusing to stay a minute longer in that haunted place. But even after she left, she could still hear it sometimes, the whisper in the vent. It would come to her in the quiet moments, when the world was still, a voice calling her name from the darkness. And every time she heard it, she remembered the words of that second voice, the deeper one that had spoken from the shadows. "She's mine," it had said. And she knew that whatever was in the vent wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, listening for the next tenant who would come to live in that apartment, who would lean in close to the vent and hear the whisper call their name. And when they did, it would already be too late. Story 6, the photograph that changed faces in the shadows. Ethan had always been fascinated by photography. There was something magical about capturing a moment in time, freezing it forever. He especially loved old cameras, the kind that needed to be handled with care, the kind that seemed to hold a piece of the past within their lenses. So when he found a vintage Polaroid camera at a flea market, he couldn't resist buying it. The camera was in surprisingly good condition, its black casing slightly worn but still sturdy. The seller warned him that it had a history, a previous owner who'd experienced some strange events with it, but Ethan didn't think much of it. He was skeptical of ghost stories and thrilled to add such a classic piece to his collection. He took the camera home and decided to test it right away. He set it up on his coffee table, pointed it at the living room, and snapped a photo. The camera made its familiar whirring sound, spitting out a blank white photo that slowly began to develop. As the image came into focus, he smiled at the sight of his cozy living room, exactly as he saw it. But then he noticed something odd. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible in the shadows, was a shape almost like a person standing there, watching him. He looked at the corner of his living room where the shape should have been, but there was nothing there. just an empty space. Ethan shook his head, thinking it must be a flaw in the photo or a trick of the light. He put the picture aside and took another, this time aiming at a different angle. The camera whirred, and the new photo began to develop. But when it did, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The shape was there again, this time closer. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a figure, blurry but unmistakable, standing in the center of the room. It seemed to be facing him, its head tilted slightly to one side. He stared at the image, a cold shiver running down his spine. He knew that the room had been empty when he took the photo. He was sure of it. Trying to calm his nerves, Ethan took a deep breath and decided to take one more picture, this time pointing the camera directly at himself. He raised the Polaroid, aimed at his reflection in the mirror across the room, and snapped the photo. As he waited for it to develop, he felt a growing sense of dread, like he was being watched. The photo developed quickly, and when it did, Ethan's heart stopped. The figure was now standing right behind him. It was clearer this time, tall and dark, its features still blurry but its shape unmistakable. Its head was bowed slightly, and though its face was still hidden in shadow, Ethan could feel its eyes boring into the back of his head. He turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. He dropped the photo and backed away, his mind racing. What was happening? Was this some kind of prank? He grabbed his phone and called his best friend, Tom, telling him everything in a rush. "Calm down," Tom said. "It's probably just a trick of the light or a double exposure. Those old cameras are quirky. I'll come over and we'll check it out together." Tom arrived within the hour, bringing with him a digital camera and a skeptical attitude. "Let's take some shots with my camera too," he said. "We'll see if we get the same results." They spent the next hour taking pictures all around the house. Tom's camera captured everything perfectly normal, just images of the empty living room, the kitchen, the hallway. No shadows, no figures. But every time they used the Polaroid, the dark figure appeared, always in a different spot, always closer. In one photo, the figure seemed to be leaning toward them, its head turned slightly as if it were listening to their conversation. In another, it was in the hallway, its hand raised, reaching for something unseen. "This is impossible," Tom whispered, staring at the last photo. "It's like it's moving, like it's getting closer with every shot." Ethan felt a chill run through him. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice shaking. Tom swallowed hard, not meeting Ethan's eyes. "Destroy the camera," he said finally. "Just get rid of it. Whatever this thing is, it's tied to the camera. If we smash it, maybe it'll stop." Desperate for an end to this nightmare, Ethan grabbed a hammer from the kitchen drawer. He raised it high and brought it down hard on the camera, smashing it into pieces. The plastic cracked, the lens shattered, and the parts scattered across the floor. But as soon as the camera broke, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. Their breath fogged in front of them, and a cold wind seemed to whip through the apartment, even though the windows were all closed. They heard a faint, echoing laugh, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do you hear that?" Ethan whispered, his face pale. Before Tom could answer, the photos they'd taken with the Polaroid began to change. They lay scattered on the table, but now, as Ethan and Tom watched, the images shifted. The dark figure in the pictures moved, its shape twisting, turning its head to look directly at them. Its face was no longer hidden. It was visible now, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through them. Its mouth was stretched into a twisted grin, like it knew something they didn't. And then, In the last photo, the figure wasn't alone. Ethan saw himself standing in the picture right next to the figure. His own face was distorted, his eyes vacant, his mouth open in a silent scream. He looked like he was trapped inside the photograph, like he was calling out to them for help. "That's not possible," Tom said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You were never in that photo." Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for the picture. The moment his fingers touched it, the room went dark, the lights flickering out as if they'd been snuffed by an unseen hand. The air around them grew thick, suffocating, and then the laughter came again, louder this time, closer. The figure in the photograph began to move, its face pressing against the inside of the image, as if it was trying to break through. Its hollow eyes locked onto Ethan's, and its mouth moved, forming words that he could finally hear. "You let me in," it whispered, its voice a twisted echo. "Now, you will take my place." Ethan stumbled back, dropping the photograph. He turned to Tom, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to get out of here," he shouted. "Now." But before they could move, the photographs on the table erupted into flames, burning with a strange blue light. The fire spread in a circle around them, trapping them in its glow. And in that moment, Ethan saw the figure again, no longer just a shadow, but real, solid, standing in the room with them. The figure stepped out of the flames, its twisted grin widening. It reached out and placed its icy hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan tried to pull away, but his body felt numb, like he was frozen in place. "You're mine now," the figure whispered in his ear. "You will stay with me." In the photograph, the world around Ethan seemed a blur, like he was being pulled backward, falling into darkness. He saw Tom's horrified face, heard his friend shouting his name, but the sound seemed distant, fading. And then everything went black. When Ethan opened his eyes, he wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was in the photograph, standing in that frozen moment, trapped in the image. He could see Tom staring down at him from the outside, his face pale with shock. "Ethan," Tom yelled, shaking the picture. "Ethan, say something." But Ethan couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He was trapped, his face forever twisted in that silent scream, staring up from the photograph as the dark figure stood beside him, grinning. Tom watched in horror as the photograph cooled, its edges curling slightly from the heat. He dropped it on the table, stumbling back, his mind reeling. He knew that Ethan was gone, lost somewhere inside that cursed Polaroid, trapped in a place where time and space meant nothing. Desperate and terrified, Tom gathered all the photographs and threw them into the fireplace, watching as they went up in flames. The fire crackled, burning the images into ashes. But even as they burned, he thought he could see the face of the figure, smiling up at him from the embers. And just when Tom thought it was over, when he thought he was finally safe, he noticed something on the mantelpiece, a new photograph, freshly developed, sitting there in plain view. It was a picture of himself, standing in the living room, with the dark figure standing right behind him. Story 7, The Locked Room Secrets Trapped Within. Isabella never wanted to live in her childhood home again. It was filled with too many memories, both good and bad, and the air inside always seemed a little too thick, as if it held on to the past. But when her parents passed away, the house was left to her, and she didn't have much choice. The old house was vast and creaky, with rooms that felt like they hadn't been touched in years. But what really unnerved her was the locked room at the end of the hallway on the second floor. It had always been locked. Even when she was a child, her parents had forbidden her from going inside, telling her it was dangerous and off limits. They never explained why, and as she grew older, Isabella stopped asking. But now, standing in that empty house, The door seemed to call to her, almost daring her to find out what lay behind it. The first night back in the house was uneventful, but Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She kept glancing down the hallway toward that locked room, its door standing like a silent sentinel at the end. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just an old room with a broken lock, nothing more. But then, on the second night, she heard the noise. It was faint at first, like a soft scratching sound coming from inside the locked room. Isabella sat up in bed, her ears straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across wood, or something trying to claw its way out. She grabbed a flashlight and crept down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She stood in front of the door, her hand shaking as she reached out to touch the doorknob. It was cold, too cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer. She pulled her hand back, suddenly afraid. "Hello," she called softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Is anyone in there?" The scratching stopped immediately, replaced by a low, almost inaudible whisper. She pressed her ear to the door, holding her breath. She could just make out a voice on the other side, a voice that sounded like it was saying her name. "Isabella." She stumbled back, her heart racing. The voice was thin and raspy, like dry leaves scraping against each other. It didn't sound quite human. She turned and fled back to her room, slamming the door behind her. She lay awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting, but the house was silent again. The next morning, Isabella decided to call a locksmith. She needed to know what was inside that room. She told herself it was just to put her mind at ease, to prove that there was nothing to fear. The locksmith arrived in the afternoon, an older man with a kind smile, who listened patiently as she explained the situation. "Been locked for a long time," he said, eyeing the door. "No worries, I'll have it open in no time." He worked quickly, the tools in his hand clicking softly as he manipulated the lock. But as he did, his expression changed. His smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion and unease. He turned to Isabella, his face pale. "This lock," he said slowly, "it's not like any I've ever seen. It's not just broken or old, it's sealed. Like someone went out of their way to make sure it couldn't be opened." "Can you still open it?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated, then nodded. "I think so, but whatever's in there, someone didn't want anyone to find it." With a final twist of his tools, there was a loud click, and the lock gave way. The door creaked open just a crack, and a rush of cold air blew into the hallway, smelling faintly of dust and something else, something decayed. Isabella's stomach tightened as she reached out and pushed the door fully open. The room was dark, the air thick and stale. She flicked on her flashlight and stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. Old furniture lay covered in sheets, and cobwebs stretched across the corners of the room. But what caught her eye was the mirror on the far wall. It was an ornate, full-length mirror with a golden frame that seemed out of place in the otherwise neglected room. Its glass was cracked, a spider web of fractures spreading out from the center. As Isabella stepped closer, she saw something that made her breath hitch, a shadow moving in the reflection. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold glass, and for a split second, the reflection changed. She saw herself in the mirror, but her face was different, pale and hollow-eyed, with a twisted smile that didn't belong to her. And standing just behind her reflection was a figure, a tall, dark silhouette, with eyes like black voids staring back at her. Isabella stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and she heard the voice again, louder this time. "Isabella, let us out," it said, almost pleading. "We've waited so long." She turned to run, but the door to the room slammed shut on its own, the lock clicking back into place. She was trapped. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the walls seemed to swallow her cries. The mirror's reflection began to change, the glass filling with faces twisted, contorted faces that looked like they were screaming in silence. And then she saw them, the eyes of the dark figure, staring at her through the reflection, unblinking, filled with hunger. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the voice hissed from behind her. Isabella spun around, her back pressed against the mirror. The room felt colder now, the air heavy with an unnatural chill. Shadows stretched from the corners, creeping along the floor toward her like fingers of darkness. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The voice echoed all around her like a whisper carried on the wind. "You opened the door. You set us free. Now you must take our place." The shadows rose up, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her toward the mirror. She tried to fight, to pull free, but the force was too strong. She felt herself being drawn into the glass, the reflection swallowing her whole. The faces in the mirror twisted and turned, and she realized they weren't just reflections, they were people, souls trapped within the mirror, screaming silently for release. She could see her own face now, twisted in horror, her mouth open in a scream that no one could hear. Her fingers clawed at the surface, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. She was no longer in the room. She was inside the mirror, looking out, watching as the shadowy figure took her place in the real world. The last thing she saw before the mirror went dark was her own reflection, smiling back at her, a smile that wasn't hers, a smile that was too wide, too cruel. Isabella felt the darkness close in around her, cold and suffocating, like the weight of 1,000 forgotten souls pressing against her. And then the whisper came again, but this time it was her own voice, echoing back at her from the glass. "You will never leave," it said. "You belong to us now." The room outside the mirror began to blur, fading into darkness. She was trapped, forever frozen in that single moment, watching the world through the warped lens of the glass. Days later, when Isabella's cousin came to check on her, they found the house empty. There was no sign of Isabella anywhere, and the locked room was once again sealed tight. The only clue left behind was a dusty old mirror, its glass cracked and dark. When her cousin looked into the mirror, they thought they saw something, a face, just for a second, staring back at them from the shadows. But when they blinked, it was gone, replaced by their own pale reflection. And somewhere deep inside that mirror, trapped within the darkness, Isabella's voice echoed faintly, calling out from the other side. "Let me out," she whispered. "Please, let me out." But no one ever did. Story 8: The Doll and the Corner Eyes That Follow. Sophie had always been uneasy around dolls. There was something unsettling about their fixed smiles and unblinking eyes. So when she inherited her grandmother's old house, she was less than thrilled to find an antique porcelain doll sitting in the corner of the attic, staring at her with lifelike eyes. The doll was dressed in a frilly, old-fashioned dress, its face painted with delicate features that looked almost too real. Its glassy blue eyes seemed to follow Sophie wherever she moved, and its mouth was curled into a smile that felt more mocking than friendly. She thought about throwing it away, but something stopped her, an odd sense that the doll didn't want to be left behind. Trying to shake off her discomfort, Sophie placed the doll on a high shelf in the living room, far away from her line of sight. She told herself that it was just an inanimate object, nothing more. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the feeling that those eyes were always watching her. That night, as she was getting ready for bed, Sophie thought she heard a noise coming from the living room, a faint rustling, like fabric shifting or the creak of something being moved. She froze in place, listening, her heart beating faster with every passing second. Then she heard it, a soft, childlike giggle, echoing through the silent house. Sophie rushed into the living room, flipping on the light, her eyes darting to the shelf where the doll sat. It was still there, its head slightly tilted, its smile frozen in place. She stared at it, trying to convince herself that she was just tired, that the noise had come from outside. But then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The doll's dress was different. It had been clean and neatly arranged when she placed it on the shelf, but now it was slightly disheveled, like it had been touched or moved. She shook her head, backing away slowly. "It's just a doll," she muttered to herself, though the words felt hollow. "It's just a stupid old doll." Over the next few days, strange things began to happen around the house. Items would disappear, only to turn up in odd places. A picture frame on the mantelpiece would tilt to one side, even though she knew she had straightened it. The lights would flicker for no reason, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. But the worst part was the doll. No matter where Sophie moved it, she would always find it back in the corner of the living room, sitting in the exact same position, with its eyes fixed on her. She tried locking it in a closet, hiding it under a pile of old clothes, even putting it in the attic. But every morning there it was, sitting in the corner like it had never been moved. One evening, after yet another fruitless attempt to get rid of the doll, Sophie sat down in the living room and stared at it, anger and frustration boiling inside her. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, half laughing at herself for talking to a doll. To her horror, the doll's head tilted ever so slightly, and its smile seemed to widen. Sophie felt a scream rise in her throat, but before she could react, the lights in the room flickered and went out. She was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting a dim glow through the window. She fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight, and aimed it at the corner where the doll had been. The corner was empty. The doll was gone. She turned slowly, the beam of light shaking in her trembling hand, searching the room. Then she heard it again, the giggle, louder this time, coming from just behind her. Sophie whipped around, and there it was, the doll, sitting on the coffee table, its eyes locked onto hers. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This isn't happening." The doll's mouth opened, ever so slightly, and from within its porcelain face came a voice, soft, sing-song, like a child's lullaby turned sour. "Play with me," Sophie had said. "Let's play a game." Sophie backed away, her mind racing. She grabbed a heavy book from the shelf and threw it at the doll with all her strength. The book hit the doll square in the chest, knocking it to the floor. But instead of shattering, the doll sat up slowly, turning its head to face her, its smile now a twisted sneer. "You can't get rid of me," the doll said, its voice now cold, filled with malice. "I'm here to stay." Desperate, Sophie grabbed the doll and ran outside. She raced to the backyard, where she had an old metal fire pit. She threw the doll into the pit and doused it with lighter fluid, her hands shaking as she flicked the lighter. The flame caught, roaring to life, and the doll's dress ignited, the flames climbing higher and higher. Sophie watched as the doll's face began to crack, the porcelain warping in the heat. For a moment, she felt a rush of relief watching the thing burn. But then, just as the flame seemed to consume the doll, it turned its head toward her, its eyes glowing a bright, unnatural blue. "You think fire can stop me?" It hissed, its voice echoing louder than ever. "You can't destroy what you don't understand." The flames flickered and then went out, snuffed like a candle. Sophie stared in disbelief as the doll sat there, its dress blackened but otherwise unharmed, its eyes still fixed on her, the twisted smile frozen in place. In a panic, Sophie grabbed a shovel and began to dig. She dug a deep hole in the far corner of the yard, throwing dirt everywhere. She picked up the doll, feeling its cold, lifeless eyes staring into her soul, and threw it into the pit. She buried it quickly, shoveling dirt over it until the hole was filled. She stood there, panting, staring at the freshly covered ground. "Stay buried," she muttered. "Stay buried and don't come back." Exhausted, she returned to the house, locking all the doors and windows. She felt a strange calm settle over her as she walked into the living room. Maybe it was over. Maybe the nightmare had finally ended. But as she turned to go to bed, her eyes fell on the corner of the living room. The doll was sitting there, its dress perfectly clean, its smile wide and knowing. "No," Sophie whispered, backing away in horror. "This can't be real." The doll's head turned slowly, and its eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. "You can't get rid of me, Sophie," it said, its voice low and mocking. "I belong to you now." Sophie grabbed her phone and dialed her friend Emma, her hands shaking so badly she could barely press the buttons. "Emma, please, you have to come over," she begged when Emma answered. "There's something wrong with this house, with this doll." Emma arrived within minutes, her face filled with concern. "Sophie, what's going on?" she asked, looking around. "Where's the doll?" Sophie pointed to the corner where the doll had been sitting, but it was gone again. The corner was empty. "No," Sophie cried. "It was right there. It was watching me." Emma tried to calm her down, but Sophie knew what she had seen. She knew the doll was still there, hiding, waiting. And then, from the shadows, the soft giggle echoed through the room again, sending a chill straight down their spines. "What was that?" Emma whispered, her face turning pale. "It's her," Sophie said, her voice hollow. "She's never going to leave." And then, in the far corner of the room, the doll emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with a cold blue light, its smile now a wicked grin that seemed to stretch wider than ever before. "You'll never get rid of me," it said, its voice filled with glee. "We're going to be friends forever, Sophie. Forever and ever." The room plunged into darkness, the lights flickering out, and in that darkness, the only thing Sophie could see were those two glowing eyes staring at her, unblinking. She heard the rustle of fabric, the soft patter of tiny feet moving closer. And then, in the silence, she heard the doll's voice, whispering in her ear. "Let's play a game." Story 9, The Phone That Shouldn't Ring Calls from Beyond. Mark was never one to believe in the paranormal. He lived by logic and reason, grounded in the tangible, dismissing anything that couldn't be explained by science. So when he found the old rotary phone in the dusty corner of his new apartment's basement, he thought nothing of it. The phone was outdated, with a faded yellow casing and a cracked rotary dial, but it added a quirky charm to the place. He carried it up to his living room, set it on a side table, and admired its vintage look. It wasn't connected to any phone line he'd checked. It was just a relic of the past, a decoration. But that night, as Mark was about to fall asleep, he heard it a loud, shrill ring that echoed through the silent apartment. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The rotary phone shouldn't have been able to ring, it wasn't connected. He listened, hoping he was imagining things, but then it rang again, its sound piercing through the stillness of the night. Mark got out of bed, his pulse quickening with every step toward the living room. The phone rang once more, louder, as if urging him to answer. He stared at it for a moment, the old dial glowing faintly in the dark. With a trembling hand, he picked up the receiver and put it to his ear. "Hello," he said, his voice cracking. For a moment, there was nothing, just a faint crackling, like distant static. Then, a voice came through, so soft and cold that it made his skin crawl. "Mark, can you hear me?" it whispered. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. "Who is this?" he demanded, gripping the receiver tighter. "You took something that belongs to me," the voice said, a hint of malice creeping into its tone. "And now I'm coming to take it back." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," he shouted, more to shake off the fear than to get answers. The line went dead with a click. He stared at the receiver in his hand, then slammed it down, his mind reeling. It was impossible. The phone wasn't even connected to a landline. There was no way anyone could have called him. Trying to convince himself it was just a prank or a malfunction, he pulled the phone's cord from the wall, though he knew it wasn't plugged into anything, and placed the receiver back down. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the silent phone, waiting for it to ring again. The next day, Mark mentioned the incident to his friend Julia. She was always the practical one, with her feet firmly on the ground. "Maybe it's some kind of old battery or something," she suggested. "Those things can have a residual charge, or it could be a cross signal, like a radio frequency interfering with it." Mark nodded, pretending to agree, but deep down, he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the voice he'd heard wasn't something that could be explained by cross signals. That night, as he was watching TV in the living room, the phone rang again. He jumped at the sound, staring at it as if it were a snake ready to strike. The ringing grew louder, more insistent, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Against his better judgment, Mark picked up the receiver. The crackling static was there again, and then the voice, clearer this time. "Mark, you shouldn't have touched my things," it whispered. "Now it's too late." "What do you want from me?" Mark shouted, his voice shaking. The voice laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the receiver. "I'm coming for you," it said simply. "I'll see you soon." The line went dead again, and this time, Mark threw the receiver down like it had burned him. He backed away from the table, staring at the phone as if it might come to life. His eyes darted around the room, expecting to see anyone lurking in the shadows. Desperate to end this nightmare, Mark decided to get rid of the phone. He grabbed it, yanking it off the table, and threw it into a box in the back of his closet. He slammed the closet door shut, trying to forget about it. He turned on every light in the apartment, hoping the brightness would drive away the darkness that seemed to be closing in on him. He lay down on the couch, too afraid to sleep in his bedroom, his eyes fixed on the closet door. For hours, he listened to the silence, waiting, hoping that the phone would stay buried and forgotten. But then, just as he was drifting off, the ringing started again. Mark shot up, staring at the closet. The phone's ring was muffled but unmistakable, echoing through the wood like a heartbeat. He couldn't believe it. It wasn't connected to anything, and he'd hidden it away. He grabbed the closet door and flung it open, the ringing louder now, like a scream demanding his attention. He reached into the box with shaking hands, pulled out the phone, and answered it. "Who are you?" he yelled. "What do you want from me?" The voice on the other end sighed, almost like it was relieved. "You finally answered," it said softly. "You let me in." Mark's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean, let you in?" he whispered. "Look behind you," the voice whispered. Mark's stomach dropped. He turned his head slowly, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run. And then he saw it standing in the corner of the living room was a shadowy figure, its form just barely visible in the dim light. Its face was obscured, hidden in the darkness, but its eyes were glowing cold and unblinking. He dropped the phone, backing away until he hit the wall. The figure moved closer, its eyes fixed on him, its mouth opening into a smile that seemed to stretch too wide, too thin. The room grew colder, the air thick with a sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. "You brought me here," the figure said, its voice now echoing in the room itself, no longer confined to the phone. "And now, I'm never leaving." The lights in the apartment flickered, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The figure seemed to grow taller, its shape twisting, becoming less human, more monstrous. Mark's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he tried to find a way out, but the darkness seemed to wrap around him, trapping him in place. "Please," he begged, "just tell me what you want." The creature's smile widened, its eyes glinting with something like amusement. "I want your fear," it said. "I feed on it. And you. You have so much to give." Mark tried to move, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The creature reached out with a long, bony hand, its fingers stretching impossibly long, wrapping around Mark's throat. He struggled to breathe, to break free, but the grip tightened, colder than ice, squeezing the life out of him. Just when he thought he was about to pass out, the grip loosened, and the creature's form began to waver, flickering like a bad television signal. It stepped back into the shadows, its smile never fading, its eyes still locked on his. "You can't get rid of me," Mark had said, its voice now a whisper in his mind. "I'm with you now, forever." The figure vanished, melting into the darkness, and the lights in the apartment came back on, flooding the room with a harsh glow. The phone lay on the floor, silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened. Mark fell to his knees, gasping for breath, staring at the phone with wide, terrified eyes. He knew now that the voice wasn't just coming from the old rotary, it was inside him, in his mind, in his very soul. He could hear it laughing, whispering, calling his name. The next morning, Mark moved out of the apartment. He left the phone behind, smashed and broken on the floor. He tried to tell himself that it was over, that the nightmare was finally behind him. But even in his new place, even miles away from that cursed apartment, he could still hear it, sometimes the faint ring of a phone that shouldn't be ringing, echoing in the back of his mind. And every time he answered it, the voice would be there, whispering his name, reminding him that no matter how far he ran, no matter how well he hid, he would never truly be alone. The phone would always find him. Story 10, The Shadow on the Wall Darkness You Can't Escape. Lena had always loved her new apartment. It was cozy and well lit, with large windows that let in the sun's warmth during the day. But as the sun went down and darkness crept in, the place seemed to change. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the room grew colder, as if the light itself was afraid to stay. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, Lena noticed something strange on the wall of her bedroom, a shadow that didn't belong. It was different from the others, too distinct, too defined. The shape was tall and narrow, like a figure standing just out of sight. She stared at it, trying to figure out what could be casting such a shadow, but the room was empty. "Must be a trick of the light," Lena muttered, shaking her head. She turned off the bedside lamp and crawled under the covers, forcing herself to forget about the unsettling shape on the wall. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The next morning, the shadow was gone. Lena felt a wave of relief, convincing herself that she had been imagining things. But that evening, as the light faded and darkness filled the room, the shadow reappeared this time, closer to her bed. Lena's breath hitched. She reached for her phone, using its flashlight to scan the room, expecting to find anything that could explain the shadow. But the room was empty, the walls bare. When she turned off the flashlight, the shadow was still there, more defined than before, its shape almost human. She turned the lights back on, and the shadow disappeared instantly. Lena's skin prickled with goosebumps. Something about this felt wrong, like the shadow was aware of her, like it moved with a purpose. She couldn't help but feel that it wasn't just a shadow, but something alive. Determined to find an answer, Lena went to her neighbor's apartment the next day. Mrs. Dalton was an elderly woman who had lived in the building for years. If anyone knew anything about strange occurrences, it would be her. Mrs. Dalton, Lena began hesitantly. Have you ever noticed anything odd about the apartments, like shadows that don't seem to have a source? Mrs. Dalton's eyes narrowed slightly, her face turning serious. You've seen it, haven't you? She asked quietly. The shadow on the wall. Lena's stomach twisted. You know about it. Mrs. Dalton nodded, her expression grim. Years ago, before you moved in, there was a tenant in your apartment who always talked about a shadow that followed him. He said it was more than just darkness, it was something that moved when he wasn't looking. He was convinced it was trying to get closer. What happened to him? Lena asked, her voice barely a whisper. He vanished, Mrs. Dalton said, her voice cracking slightly. Just disappeared one night without a trace. The police never found him, but I always knew. That shadow took him. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. She thanked Mrs. Dalton and hurried back to her apartment, her mind racing. The shadow wasn't just an illusion. It was real, and it was getting closer. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She sat up in bed, the room bathed in the soft glow of a lamp. She kept her eyes on the wall, where the shadow had appeared, waiting for it to return. And when the clock struck midnight, it did. The shadow was there, more defined than ever, its shape almost unmistakably human. It stood at the edge of the room, just beyond the light's reach, its head tilted slightly as if watching her. Lena felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. She knew she couldn't keep running from it, pretending it wasn't there. Who are you? She asked, her voice trembling. What do you want? To her horror, the shadow moved. It stretched upward, its form elongating, twisting like smoke, and then it took a step forward. Lena's breath caught in her throat. It was no longer just a shadow, it was a figure, emerging from the wall, becoming more solid with each passing second. I know you, a voice whispered from the darkness. It was soft, almost a hiss, like a breath that had been trapped for years. You can't hide from me. Lena grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it directly at the shadow. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but the shadow didn't disappear. It flinched slightly, as though annoyed, but then it continued to move forward, its eyes dark pits in its face locking onto hers. You're in my house, the shadow said, its voice sharper now. You're where you shouldn't be. Lena felt a scream rise in her throat, but it wouldn't come out. She stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her trembling hand. The shadow's form was becoming clearer, more human-like, its features twisted into a mocking grin. You'll never leave, it whispered, the words echoing off the walls. I'm a part of you now. Desperate, Lena reached for the light switch and flooded the room with light. The shadow vanished instantly, dissolving back into the wall like it had never been there. She stood there, panting, her heart racing, every muscle in her body tense. But as she watched the wall, she saw it, the shadow reappearing, slowly creeping back into view. No matter how bright the light, no matter how many lamps she turned on, the shadow always found a way to return. Lena knew then that she needed to get out of the apartment. She grabbed her keys, not bothering to pack, and ran for the door. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, the room went pitch black, the lights flickering out in unison. The shadow was there, filling the entire wall now, towering over her, its shape stretching and contorting into something monstrous. It reached out, a long, dark hand extending from the wall, its fingers like tendrils of smoke wrapping around her wrist. "You can't leave," it hissed, pulling her closer. "You belong to the darkness." Lena pulled with all her strength, but the grip was too strong. She felt the cold of the shadow's touch seep into her skin, spreading like ice through her veins. Her vision blurred, and she could see her own reflection in the dark eyes of the shadow, her face pale, twisted in terror. "Please," she screamed. "Let me go." The shadow's face leaned closer, its twisted smile growing wider. "You invited me in," it said softly, "and now you will never leave." Just when she thought she was lost, the lights in the room flickered back on. The shadow recoiled, its form wavering like smoke caught in a breeze. Lena fell to the floor, gasping for air, her skin freezing where the shadow had touched her. She scrambled to her feet and ran out of the apartment, not stopping until she was outside, under the safety of the streetlights. She turned to look at the windows of her apartment, half expecting to see the shadow watching her from inside. But the windows were dark, empty. The apartment looked just as ordinary as it always had, but she knew it was anything but. She couldn't go back in there. Not ever. Lena moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. She didn't care about her things, she only wanted to get as far away from that shadow as possible. She rented a new place, one with bright, open spaces and no dark corners. But even in her new apartment, with the sun streaming in through the windows, she could still feel it, the cold touch of the shadow on her skin, the memory of its whisper in her ear. And sometimes late at night, when she was all alone, she would catch a glimpse of it out of the corner of her eye, a shadow on the wall that didn't belong. A shadow that was watching her, waiting for the moment when the lights would flicker out. And she knew that no matter how far she ran, no matter where she hid, the darkness would always find her. It would always be there, lurking in the corners, just beyond the reach of the light. The shadow on the wall was more than just darkness. It was a promise that the light would not always save her. Story 11, the music box melody of the unseen. Alyssa had always loved antiques, so when she stumbled upon an old music box at a small, dusty shop in town, she couldn't resist buying it. The box was small, with an intricate design etched into its wooden surface and a delicate brass crank on the side. It looked like it had once belonged to another time, another world. The shop owner was a frail old man with eyes that seemed to look right through her. As she paid for the music box, he gave her a strange look and said, "Be careful with that. Some things are better left unheard." Alyssa brushed off his words with a polite smile, chalking it up to an old man's superstitions. She brought the music box home and placed it on her dresser. That evening, as the sun set and darkness filled her room, she decided to wind it up and listen to its tune. She turned the crank slowly, hearing the gears inside click and whir. The lid of the music box opened, revealing a tiny, delicate ballerina that began to spin in time with the melody. The tune was soft and beautiful, a haunting lullaby that seemed to echo through the room. But as she listened, Alyssa felt a chill creep down her spine. There was something off about the melody, something hidden in the notes that she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was almost as if she could hear a whisper woven into the music, a voice so faint that it seemed to come from far away. She shook her head, telling herself she was imagining things, and closed the music box. The melody stopped abruptly, the ballerina frozen mid-twirl. But that night, as she lay in bed, the tune seemed to play on, echoing faintly in her mind, like a memory she couldn't shake. Around midnight, Alyssa awoke to a sound that made her blood run cold. The music box was playing on its own. She sat up in bed, staring at the dresser in the darkness. The box was open, the ballerina spinning slowly, and the tune was louder now, clearer, filling the room with its haunting melody. She climbed out of bed, her hands trembling as she reached for the box. As she did, the music stopped, and she noticed something strange: the ballerina's face. Its expression had changed. The once delicate, serene smile was now a twisted frown, and its eyes seemed to be looking directly at her. Alyssa slammed the lid shut, her heart pounding. "It's just a trick of the light," she whispered to herself, trying to calm down. "I'm just tired." But the next day, the melody stayed with her, playing over and over in her head, no matter how hard she tried to block it out. It was as if the music had sunk into her soul, embedding itself deep inside her mind. Determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, Alyssa called her friend Megan over. Megan was practical, not easily spooked, and always had a way of making sense of things that seemed impossible. "You're telling me it played on its own?" Megan asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's creepy, but it's probably just an old mechanism glitching out. Let's wind it up again and see what happens." Alyssa hesitated but agreed, turning the crank on the music box once more. The lid opened and the ballerina began to spin. But this time, as the music played, they both heard it clearly: a whisper, hidden beneath the melody, repeating the same words over and over. "Help me. Let me out." Megan's face turned pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Alyssa nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, what is that?" The whisper grew louder, and suddenly the ballerina stopped spinning. Its head snapped toward them, its eyes wide and unblinking, a single tear painted on its porcelain cheek. The whisper turned into a soft sobbing, the voice now clear and full of sorrow. "She's trapped," the voice said, echoing from within the music box. "She's been trapped for so long." Megan jumped back, nearly knocking over the lamp. "What's in there, Alyssa? What is that thing?" Alyssa reached out to close the box, but the lid wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it open, forcing her to keep listening. The melody twisted, warping into a darker tune, and the tiny ballerina's expression seemed to change again, becoming more desperate, more human. "Please," the voice begged, now louder, echoing in the room. "You have to help me. Before he comes." Alyssa's skin prickled with fear. "Before who comes?" she asked, her voice a whisper. And then the music stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural laugh that seemed to shake the air around them. The lights in the room flickered, and the air grew cold, so cold that their breath misted in front of them. "He's here," the voice said, trembling with fear. "He's found me." The room plunged into darkness, and a shadow stretched across the wall, tall, menacing, with a face that was nothing but darkness and two glowing eyes. The figure seemed to emerge from the music box itself, growing larger, filling the room with its presence. "You let her out," the shadow said in a voice that was more growl than words. "And now you will take her place." Alyssa and Megan stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with terror. The shadow's hands reached out, long and thin, like tendrils of smoke curling around the music box. The lid slammed shut with a loud snap, and the ballerina's tiny face turned toward Alyssa one last time. Its eyes were pleading, desperate. Run, the ballerina's voice screamed, echoing in their minds. But before they could move, the shadow lunged at them, its dark form engulfing the room. Alyssa felt the cold grip of its fingers wrap around her wrist, pulling her toward the box. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but the pull was too strong, like a whirlpool dragging her under. Megan grabbed Alyssa's arm, trying to pull her back, but the shadow's grip was relentless. "I won't let you go," Megan shouted, tears streaming down her face. The shadow laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the room. "It's too late," it said. "She's mine now." The music box began to glow with a strange, otherworldly light, its melody warping into a distorted scream. Alyssa's vision blurred, the world around her twisting, warping like a nightmare come to life. She saw the ballerina inside the box, its eyes now wide with terror, its mouth open in a silent scream. "Please, no," Alyssa cried, reaching out one last time. "Don't let him take me." And then, with a final deafening snap, the lid of the music box slammed shut. The light went out, the shadow vanished, and the room fell silent. Megan collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. She reached for the music box, her hands shaking, and slowly opened the lid. The ballerina was still there, its face serene once more, spinning in time with the soft, haunting melody. But something was different. The ballerina was no longer just a tiny figurine. It had Alyssa's face, frozen in an expression of fear, its eyes wide and lifelike, staring up at Megan as if pleading for help. "Alyssa," Megan whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh my God, what happened to you?" The melody played on, soft and sweet, echoing through the silent room. And as Megan stared into the ballerina's eyes, she heard it a whisper, faint and distant, coming from the music box. "Help me. Let me out." But Megan knew that once you were inside, there was no way out. The next day, Megan took the music box back to the antique shop, desperate to find the old man who had sold it to Alyssa. But when she arrived, the shop was empty, abandoned, like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were covered in dust, and a sign on the door read "Closed forever." Megan left the music box on the doorstep, its haunting melody still playing faintly as she walked away. She knew she could never destroy it, never escape the music that called out from within. And late at night, when the world is quiet and still, she can still hear it, the soft notes of the music box playing in her dreams, echoing with Alyssa's voice, begging for release. But Megan knows the truth now. Some things are better left unheard. Story 12: The Face in the Mirror, Reflections of Fear. Natalie always felt uneasy around mirrors. There was something unsettling about the way they reflected her image, like they held more than just her reflection. It didn't help that the old house she had just moved into had a massive antique mirror in the hallway, its glass slightly tarnished, its ornate wooden frame covered in intricate carvings that seemed to twist and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She had considered getting rid of it, but the mirror seemed to be a part of the house itself, too heavy and ancient to move easily. And so there it stayed, looming in the hallway like a silent sentinel, watching her every time she passed by. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, Natalie stood in front of the mirror, wiping off a smudge from the glass. As she did, she noticed something odd in the reflection, a faint shadow that seemed to flicker just behind her. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone there, but the hallway was empty. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "It's just your imagination," she muttered to herself, forcing a smile. But when she looked back at the mirror, her smile faded. The shadow was gone, but her own reflection seemed different. Her eyes looked darker, almost hollow, and her expression was strained, like she was trying to hide something. Natalie backed away from the mirror, her heart beating a little faster. She told herself it was just the stress of moving into a new place, that she was tired and seeing things. She turned off the hallway light and headed to bed, trying to forget the strange reflection. But that night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the mirror, about the shadow she had seen. It was as if the reflection had left a mark on her mind, a ghostly image that wouldn't go away. The next day, she decided to cover the mirror with a sheet. She didn't need to see her reflection every time she walked by, and it made her feel better to have it hidden. But as she draped the sheet over the mirror, she thought she saw a movement again, a flicker in the glass, like someone waving from the other side. Natalie stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. "It's nothing," she whispered, more to convince herself than anything else. "Just my imagination." That night, as she lay in bed, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails gently tapping on glass. She sat up, her eyes wide in the darkness, listening. The sound was coming from the hallway from the mirror. She grabbed her phone, using its flashlight as she stepped out into the hall. The sheet she had placed over the mirror was moving, rippling slightly as if touched by an unseen hand. Her stomach twisted in fear, but she forced herself to step closer, reaching out to pull the sheet away. When she did, the mirror was clear again, just a reflection of the empty hallway. She let out a shaky breath, feeling foolish for getting so worked up. But then, as she turned to go back to bed, something in the mirror's reflection made her stop cold. Her reflection wasn't moving. Natalie stood frozen in place, staring at the mirror. Her reflection was facing her, but it wasn't copying her movements. It was just standing there, staring at her with a twisted grin that didn't belong to her face. What the Natalie whispered, reaching out a trembling hand toward the mirror. The moment her fingers touched the glass, her reflection's grin widened. Its eyes, once hollow, now glowed with a cold light, like twin orbs of darkness. And then the reflection spoke. "You can't hide from me," it said in a voice that sounded almost like her own, but warped, twisted. "I've been waiting for so long, to be free." Natalie yanked her hand back, stumbling away from the mirror, her mind racing. She turned and ran down the hallway, slamming her bedroom door behind her. She pressed her back against the door, breathing heavily, trying to convince herself that it was all just a nightmare, a trick of the mind. But then, from the other side of the door, she heard a soft whispering voice, like a cold breeze brushing against the wood. "Let me out, Natalie," the voice said, its tone dripping with malice. "You're the one who called me." The next morning, Natalie was ready to call a friend for help, anyone who could tell her she wasn't losing her mind. She dialed her friend Laura, explaining everything in a rush. "You've got to come over," Natalie said, her voice cracking. "Something's wrong with this mirror. It's like there's something inside it." Laura arrived within the hour, armed with skepticism and a flashlight. "All right, show me this haunted mirror," she said, trying to sound calm but glancing nervously at the covered glass. Natalie pulled the sheet off the mirror, holding her breath. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The reflection showed nothing but the two of them standing in the hallway. Laura laughed, shaking her head. "See? It's just a mirror, Nat. You're imagining things." But as she said those words, the lights flickered, and in that split second of darkness, they both saw Natalie's reflection wasn't standing with them anymore. It was behind Laura, grinning that twisted grin. "Laura," moved, Natalie screamed, but it was too late. Laura turned around, and the lights came back on. The reflection had returned to its place, its smile gone, replaced by a look of cold indifference. But something had changed in the room, a chill, like the air itself had turned to ice. "What the hell was that?" Laura whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw it, Natalie. I saw it move." Natalie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It's trying to get out," she said, her voice trembling. "It wants to take my place." Desperate, they tried to cover the mirror again, but the sheet kept slipping off, as if an invisible hand was pulling it away. The reflection watched them, its eyes following their every move, its grin returning, wider than ever. "You can't cover me up," the reflection taunted. "I'm here to stay." The lights flickered again, and this time the reflection didn't just grin, it stepped forward. Its hands reached out from the mirror, its fingers long and twisted, pressing against the glass from the inside. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and then it cracked, a web of fractures spreading from where its fingers touched. "You can't stop me," it hissed, its voice echoing through the room. "I'm your true self, the one you hide." Natalie and Laura backed away, but the mirror's cracks continued to spread, dark lines snaking across its surface like veins. The reflection was no longer just a reflection, it was alive, breaking free from the glass, its eyes now black voids that seemed to pull in the light around them. With a final shudder, the mirror shattered, pieces of glass flying across the room. But the reflection didn't vanish. It stepped out of the mirror, its form now solid, its twisted grin splitting its face in two. "You've let me out," it said, its voice filled with triumph. "Now, you will take my place." Before Natalie could react, the reflection lunged at her, its hands cold as ice, wrapping around her wrists. She felt the force pulling her backward into the broken shards of the mirror, as if the glass itself was swallowing her whole. She looked up at Laura, her eyes wide with terror. "Help me," Natalie screamed. "Don't let it take me." But Laura was frozen in place, her face pale with shock. She watched in horror as Natalie's body was pulled into the mirror, her scream fading into a hollow echo. The glass reformed around her, sealing her inside. Natalie's reflection was now on the outside, standing with Laura, its grin replaced by a calm smile. It turned to Laura, its eyes filled with a twisted kind of joy. "Thank you for setting me free," it said softly. "I've waited so long for this." Laura stumbled back, tears streaming down her face. "What are you?" she whispered. "I'm her," the reflection said simply. "I'm everything she hides from the world. And now, I'm in control." It turned and walked away, leaving Laura staring at the mirror. Inside the glass, Natalie's face was still visible, her hands pressed against the surface, her eyes wide with terror. She was trapped, her silent scream frozen in time. The reflection paused at the door and looked back at Laura, that twisted grin spreading across its face once more. "Don't worry," it said. "She's safe in there. And now, the real fun begins." With that, it turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Laura alone with the shattered pieces of the mirror. And as she looked into the shards, she could still see Natalie's eyes staring back at her, begging for help from the other side. But there was nothing Laura could do. Natalie was gone, lost in the world of reflections, replaced by a version of herself she never wanted to meet. And even now, in the dead of night, Laura can still hear the faint sound of tapping on glass, echoing from the broken mirror. A voice that whispers, "Let me out." Tori 13, the key that didn't fit unlocking the unknown. Jason had always been fascinated by mysteries, the kind of puzzles that required thinking outside the box. So, when he found a strange old key at a yard sale, he couldn't resist buying it. The key was heavy, made of tarnished brass, with an ornate design on the handle that seemed to twist into patterns he couldn't quite decipher. There was something about it that felt important, like it was waiting to unlock something forgotten. The woman who sold it to him gave him a knowing smile and said, "That key doesn't belong to any door you know." She said it in a tone that was both teasing and foreboding, making the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Jason laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to add some drama to the sale. He took the key home and placed it on the small table in his hallway, intending to add it to his collection of oddities. But later that night, he noticed something strange when he passed by the table. The key seemed to glow faintly, a soft, eerie light emanating from the metal. He rubbed his eyes, chalking it up to exhaustion, and went to bed. That night, Jason woke up to a sound of faint scratching, like metal scraping against wood. He sat up in bed, listening. The noise was coming from the hallway, from where he had left the key. He grabbed his flashlight and slowly crept toward the table. The key was lying there, just as he'd left it, but now there were deep scratches on the wooden surface underneath it, as if it had been moving on its own. He picked up the key, examining it closely. The ornate design on the handle seemed to twist and move under his fingers, almost alive. A chill ran down his spine as he felt the cold metal pulse slightly in his hand, as if it was reacting to his touch. Then he noticed something else, a number etched faintly into the metal. The number 13. Maybe it belongs to an old lock, Jason muttered to himself, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. But deep down, he knew that this was no ordinary key. The next day, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the key was calling to him. He spent hours searching his house, testing every lock, every door, but the key didn't fit anywhere. Frustrated, he sat on the floor, staring at the number 13 etched into the key, wondering what it could mean. That evening, as he was locking up for the night, he noticed a small door at the back of his basement he had never really paid attention to. It was old, almost hidden behind a stack of boxes, and seemed to have been there for decades. He felt a strange pull toward it, like he was supposed to find it, like the key had led him there. He knelt down and inserted the key into the lock. To his surprise, it fit perfectly. He hesitated for a moment, a shiver of anticipation running through him, and then he turned the key. The lock clicked, and the door swung open with a slow, creaking groan. Beyond the door was a small, dark room, colder than the rest of the basement. The air inside felt heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. Jason stepped inside, his flashlight revealing dusty shelves filled with old books, strange trinkets, and a large mirror covered with a tattered cloth in the corner. As he approached the mirror, he felt the temperature in the room drop even more. He hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out and pulled the cloth away. The mirror's surface was cracked, its reflection distorted. But what caught his eye was the writing scrawled across the glass, backwards as if written from inside. "Do not let him out, Dot." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. He ran to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The key he had used was no longer in the lock, it had vanished. A low growl echoed through the small room, and he spun around to see the mirror beginning to ripple like water. A dark shape was moving within the glass, its eyes glowing a deep, unnatural red. Jason's breath hitched in his throat as the shape grew larger, forming into a shadowy figure with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to blur in and out of focus. "You set me free," the figure said, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to come from the very walls. "You turned the key. Jason backed away, his mind racing. I didn't mean to, he shouted. I was just curious, I didn't know. The figure's grin widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Curiosity comes with a price, it said, stepping closer, its eyes never leaving Jason's. And now you will pay. He turned and banged on the door, screaming for help, but the walls seemed to absorb his cries, the sound swallowed by the oppressive darkness of the room. He could feel the cold fingers of the shadowy figure reaching out, brushing against the back of his neck, sending a jolt of fear through his entire body. Desperate, Jason grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting the twisted grin of the creature. But the moment the mirror broke, the shadowy figure didn't disappear. It emerged from the fragments, fully formed, its smile now a cruel sneer. You think breaking the glass can trap me, it taunted, its voice echoing through the small space. I'm no longer bound by this world or the next. The creature lunged at Jason, its cold, inky tendrils wrapping around his arms, dragging him toward the broken shards of the mirror. He struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the force was too strong, too overwhelming. The broken pieces of the mirror began to reform around him, encasing him in a prison of glass. You unlocked the door, the creature said, its voice now soft and mocking. And now you'll take my place. Jason's vision blurred as the mirror closed in around him, trapping him inside. He looked out through the cracked glass, seeing his own terrified face staring back at him, but with eyes that were not his own. They were the eyes of the shadowy creature, filled with malice and darkness. No, Jason screamed, his voice muffled by the glass. Please, let me out. The creature's grin widened as it stood on the other side, now in Jason's form, its eyes filled with twisted glee. It picked up the key from the floor and placed it in its pocket, turning to face the world beyond the small room. Thank you for setting me free, it said, its voice now perfectly mimicking Jason's. I've been trapped in that mirror for so long. Jason pounded on the inside of the glass, his fists hitting the mirror's surface, but no one could hear him. He was locked inside, a prisoner in his own reflection, watching as the creature that now wore his face left the room and walked into his life. The door to the basement swung open with ease, and the creature, now indistinguishable from Jason, smiled to itself as it stepped into the light. The old key dangled from its pocket, the number 13 shining in the dim light, a reminder of the lock that should never have been opened. And as it disappeared into the world outside, the last thing Jason saw through the mirror's fractured surface was his own face, twisted in a silent scream, forever trapped in the darkness of the glass. The next day, when friends and family came looking for Jason, they found the basement door sealed tight. No key would fit, no tool could force it open. They called his name, searched the house, but there was no trace of him. And the mirror in the small, dark room remained silent, its surface cracked, reflecting only the empty room. But if you looked closely, just for a moment, you might see something, a face staring back at you, eyes wide with terror, pleading for help from the other side of the glass. A face that looked just like Jason's. Story 14, the book, that wrote itself words of darkness. Claire loved books more than anything. They were her escape from reality, her comfort when life got too overwhelming. So when she stumbled upon a dusty, leather-bound book in an old bookstore hidden down a narrow alley, she couldn't resist buying it. The cover was blank, the leather worn and cracked, but something about the weight of it in her hands felt important, like it was waiting for her to discover its secrets. The shop owner, a frail woman with sharp eyes, gave Claire a peculiar look as she handed over the money. That book is not like the others, the woman said quietly. It writes itself. It shows you what it wants you to see. Claire laughed nervously, dismissing the warning as nothing more than a quirky sales pitch. She thanked the woman and carried the book home, excited to read her new find. But when she sat down and opened the cover, her excitement turned to confusion. The pages were blank, every single one of them, except for the first, which contained a single sentence scrawled in elegant handwriting. "This book is yours to finish. Claire stared at the words, puzzled. She thought it must be some kind of journal or a creative writing exercise. She decided to play along, picking up a pen to write her name on the first page. But as soon as her pen touched the paper, the ink spread across the page in swirling patterns, forming words that she hadn't written. "Hello, Claire," the words read. "I've been waiting for you. She dropped the pen, her hand trembling. "What the?" she muttered, staring at the book. The words on the page seemed to pulse slightly, like they were alive, like they were watching her. Trying to shake off the unease, Claire closed the book and set it aside. She told herself that it must have been a clever trick, a reactive ink that appeared when it came into contact with pressure. But even as she walked away, she felt like the book's words were burned into her mind. Later that night, Claire couldn't resist the urge to open the book again. When she did, the words on the page had changed. New sentences had appeared, describing her in eerie detail the clothes she was wearing, the way she'd nervously tucked her hair behind her ear, the very words she had muttered to herself. "What is this?" Claire whispered, her voice shaky. "How does it know?" The book seemed to respond, ink bleeding onto the next blank page, writing itself as she watched in horror. "You are the one I've been waiting for," it wrote. "You will write the story with M.E. Claire slammed the book shut and threw it across the room, her heart pounding. It lay there on the floor, its cover innocently closed, as if nothing had happened. She knew she should get rid of it, burn it, but something in her felt tethered to the book, like it held a piece of her she couldn't let go. The following day, Claire tried to ignore the book entirely. She buried herself in work, met up with friends, did everything she could to keep her mind off it. But when she returned home that evening, the book was no longer where she'd left it. It was sitting on her desk, open, waiting for her. Curiosity and dread warred within her, but she felt compelled to read what was written on the new page. The words were more sinister now, their tone darker. "You cannot run from me, Claire," it said. "I know your fears. I know your secrets. And soon, everyone else will know them too. As the ink continued to spread across the page, Claire saw her worst memories appearing in the book, moments she had never spoken of, things she had tried to bury deep inside. The book was revealing her past, her regrets, the darkest corners of her soul. She could see the betrayal in the eyes of her best friend, the lies she had told, the guilt that gnawed at her every day. "Stop it," Claire screamed, slamming the book shut. "You have no right." But when she looked at her hands, she saw ink stains on her fingers, as if she had written those words herself. The ink spread up her arms, like veins of darkness seeping into her skin. Panicked, Claire grabbed her phone and called her friend Emily, her voice trembling as she explained what was happening. "Please, you have to come over," she begged. "This book, it's doing something to me. I think it's alive." Emily arrived quickly, her face filled with concern. "Claire, are you okay?" she asked. "Where's this book you're talking about?" Claire pointed to the desk where she had left the book, but it wasn't there. It was now lying open on her bed, the pages fluttering like they were caught in a breeze. Emily cautiously approached it, peering down at the text. "What the?" Emily whispered, her eyes widening. "It's writing something." They both watched in horror as new words appeared on the page, the ink bleeding through as if an unseen hand was scrawling them. You shouldn't have called her, the book wrote. Now, she's part of the story too. The lights in the room flickered, and suddenly the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that their breath turned to mist. The book's pages started turning on their own, faster and faster, whipping back and forth like they were alive. Claire tried to shut the book, but the pages refused to close. The words on the pages shifted, rearranging themselves into a single command. Finish the story. The room plunged into darkness, and in the faint light from the hallway, Claire saw a shadow rising from the book, a figure taking shape, its face twisted into a cruel smile. It reached out with long, inky fingers, grasping for her. Run, Emily screamed, pulling her toward the door. But the shadow was faster. It grabbed Claire by the wrist, its touch cold as ice, pulling her back toward the book. She felt her feet leaving the ground, the room spinning around her, as if she was being sucked into the pages themselves. No, Claire shouted, struggling against its grip. Let me go. The book's voice echoed through the room, a hollow laugh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. You started this, it taunted, and now you will never leave. Emily reached for Claire's other hand, her grip slipping as the shadow's pull grew stronger. The book's pages wrapped around Claire like tendrils, pulling her down into its depths. She could feel the cold ink seeping into her skin, merging with her, binding her to the words. Don't let go, Claire cried, tears streaming down her face. Please don't let it take me. Emily tried to hold on, but the force was too strong. With a final, desperate scream, Claire was pulled into the book, the pages slamming shut behind her. The room fell silent, the air still, as if nothing had ever happened. Emily stood there, staring at the closed book, her hands shaking. She reached out, hesitating, then slowly opened the cover. The first page was no longer blank. It was filled with words, new words, written in Claire's handwriting. I am trapped inside, it read. The book is alive. It's rewriting ME. Emily's eyes filled with horror as she saw Claire's face staring up at her from the page, her expression twisted in fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. No, Emily whispered, backing away. This can't be real. But the book's pages turned again, and new words appeared, as if the story was still being written. The story never ends, it wrote. Your next. Emily dropped the book, running out of the room, but she knew she could never truly escape. Somewhere, in the quiet of the night, she would always hear it, the soft rustle of pages turning, the whisper of ink bleeding onto the paper. And she knew that as long as the book existed, Claire's story would continue to write itself, drawing others into its darkness. The book waits, its blank pages eager to be filled. It's only a matter of time. Story 15, the figure in the window, eyes that never leave. Jake had always loved the peacefulness of living in the countryside. His new house was perfect, isolated, surrounded by trees, with large windows that looked out over a quiet meadow. It was exactly the kind of place where he could relax and clear his mind. But from the first night he moved in, something felt off. It started when he was unpacking boxes in the living room. As the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky a deep shade of purple, Jake glanced out the window. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the meadow, just barely visible in the fading light. He blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the shadows, he muttered to himself, shaking off the unease. He closed the blinds, telling himself he was just tired from the move. But even as he turned away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That night, as Jake lay in bed, he woke up suddenly, his senses on high alert. He didn't know what had woken him, but the room felt different, colder, like a chill had settled in. He got up, his eyes drawn to the large window that faced the meadow. He hesitated, then pulled back the curtain, his breath fogging up the glass. And there it was. A figure stood in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was tall, its outline blurry, like it was cloaked in shadows. Jake's pulse quickened, and he squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure seemed to blur and shift, like smoke in the wind. "Who's out there?" Jake called, his voice cracking slightly. "Who are you?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, its head tilted slightly to the side. Jake closed the curtain quickly, his hands shaking. He grabbed his phone and called the local police, explaining that there was someone outside his house. When the police arrived, they searched the property thoroughly. They found no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The officer gave Jake a skeptical look and said, "Are you sure it wasn't just an animal or something? Maybe a trick of the light?" Jake nodded reluctantly, even though he knew what he'd seen wasn't a trick. He thanked the officer and locked all the doors and windows, trying to convince himself that it was nothing. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. The next few days passed without incident, and Jake started to relax. He told himself that maybe it really had been a trick of the light, or maybe he was just tired from the move. But then, one evening, as he sat in his living room, he felt that familiar chill again. He turned his head slowly toward the window. The figure was back. This time it was closer, standing just outside the window, its face still obscured in shadow. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He reached for the lamp, switching it on, and the light flooded the room. But the figure didn't vanish. It stood there, staring in, its eyes glinting like two cold stars. He bolted to the window, flinging it open. "What do you want?" he shouted. "Leave me alone." But the moment the window opened, the figure disappeared, melting into the darkness. There was no sound, no movement, just silence, as if it had never been there at all. Jake slammed the window shut, drawing the blinds tight, his mind racing. He called his friend Mark, explaining everything in a rush. "You have to come over," Jake said, his voice shaking. "I'm not going crazy, there's someone out there." Mark arrived within the hour, armed with a flashlight and a skeptical expression. "All right, show me where you saw this figure," Mark said, his eyes darting around the property. Jake led him to the window, pointing to the spot where the figure had been. "It was right there," he insisted. "I swear it was watching me." Mark shone the flashlight into the darkness, sweeping it across the meadow. "There's nothing out here," Jakey said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Wait," Jake said, pointing toward a tree at the edge of the property. "Do you see that?" They both stared as the flashlight beam landed on the base of the tree. There, carved into the bark, were deep gouges, marks that formed the outline of a face. Two eyes and a twisted smile stared back at them, almost like the tree itself was grinning. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered, stepping back. Jake's stomach twisted in fear. "It's been watching me," he said, barely above a whisper. "It's marking its territory." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure's outline, the twisted grin carved into the tree. He got up to check the windows for the 10th time, making sure they were locked, when he felt a cold breath on his neck. He turned around slowly, dreading what he might see. The figure was inside the house. It stood in the middle of the living room, its face still hidden in darkness, but now it was more solid, more real. Jake's breath came in short gasps as he stared at it, unable to move. "Get out," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Get out of my house." The figure's head tilted, and then it moved slowly, almost gliding toward him. Its eyes were visible now, gleaming like twin points of light in the darkness, its smile wide and knowing. "You invited me in," it said in a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling. "And now I'm here to stay." Jake ran for the front door, but the moment he touched the doorknob, it froze under his hand. The entire house seemed to shift, the walls closing in, the windows darkening as if they were covered by a thick fog. The figure was suddenly in front of him, its cold hand reaching out to touch his face. "You belong to me now," it said, its voice echoing in his mind. Jake felt the world spinning, the air around him growing thin. He stumbled backward, falling to the floor, his eyes locked on the figure's twisted smile. It reached down, its face inches from his, and he finally saw it clearly. It was his own face. The face was a distorted, nightmare version of himself, its eyes empty black pits, its mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, too sharp. The figure leaned closer, whispering in his ear. "You let me in," it said softly. "You can never leave." With a final surge of desperation, Jake reached for the lamp beside him, smashing it against the figure. The light shattered, plunging the room into darkness, and for a moment everything was still. When the lights flickered back on, the figure was gone. Jake sat up, gasping for breath, staring at the empty space in front of him. He thought it was over, that he'd somehow driven it away. But then he looked at the window. The figure was back, its face pressed against the glass, grinning that awful smile, its eyes locked onto his. And in the reflection, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. His own face wasn't his anymore. It was the twisted face of the figure, staring back at him with eyes full of darkness. "No," Jake whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." The reflection's mouth moved, and he heard its voice in his head, mocking him. "You're mine now," it said, "and every time you look in the mirror, you'll see me." The figure disappeared from the window, but Jake knew it was still there, watching him from the shadows. He could feel its presence in every dark corner, in every flicker of the light. The next day, Jake tried to leave the house, but no matter how far he drove, no matter where he went, he couldn't escape. He would look into any reflective surface, a window, a mirror, even the water in a puddle, and there it was. His own face, twisted into that same smile, staring back at him. And he knew that no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, he would never be alone. The figure would always be there, waiting in the darkness, just behind the glass. Watching, smiling, waiting for him to look.